What if you closed your eyes tonight and opened them in humanity's darkest hour only, to discover something extraordinary about the human spirit that might change how you see your own challenges forever? Imagine, if you will, settling into your comfortable bed, feeling the soft warmth of your blankets, knowing that when morning comes, you'll have fresh water at the turn of a tap, food in your kitchen, and medicine if you need it. But what if, instead, you awaken to the sound of church bells tolling not for celebration, but for the dead? What if you opened your eyes to find yourself in the year 1351, in the very heart of what historians would later call humanity's greatest catastrophe? Dear listener, as you rest in your cozy corner of the present, let me take you on a gentle journey to a time when simply surviving another day was humanity's greatest triumph. Tonight, we'll explore together what it would truly mean to live through the year that changed everything and discover why the resilience, creativity, and compassion that emerged from humanity's darkest hour hold profound lessons for navigating uncertainty in our own lives. Picture yourself awakening in a small village somewhere in medieval Europe. The year is 1351, and outside your humble dwelling, the world is transforming in ways that would reshape civilization forever. This isn't just any year in history, dear friend. This is the year when approximately 1/3 of Europe's population would perish from a disease so devastating that survivors would spend generations trying to comprehend what had befallen them. But here, in this quiet moment before we step outside, let's take comfort in understanding that every person who lived through this darkest of times possessed something remarkable. Something that still lives within you today. They possessed an unbreakable human spirit, a resilience that would eventually lead not to humanity's destruction, but to its renaissance. Even in 1351, even at the very height of catastrophe, people found ways to love, to hope, to care for one another with a tenderness that would make angels weep. Imagine the gentle sounds of your medieval morning. Perhaps there's the soft patter of rain against shuttered windows, the distant lowing of cattle if your village is fortunate enough to still have them, or the whispered prayers of a neighbor beginning their day. In this moment, before the full weight of your circumstances settles upon you, there's something almost peaceful about this simpler time. No rushing traffic, no electronic buzzing, just the timeless rhythm of human life continuing against all odds. Your dwelling is modest but sturdy, built by hands that understood the art of creating shelter from whatever materials the land provided. Stone walls keep out winter's icy grip, though they also hold in the dampness that seems to cling to everything in this era. The faint scent of wood smoke from last night's fire still lingers in the air, mixing with the earthy smell of straw bedding and the subtle aroma of herbs hanging in bundles from the rafters. These herbs aren't just for cooking, dear traveler. In a world where medical knowledge is limited and physicians scarce, these simple plants represent hope, healing, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who learned to find medicine in nature's pharmacy. As you sit on the edge of your simple bed, feeling the rough texture of wool blankets beneath your fingers, you might notice how quiet the world seems compared to the bustling medieval villages you might have imagined. This silence isn't peaceful, though. It's the silence of absence, of empty houses where families once laughed and argued and dreamed. The great pandemic has already swept through much of Europe like a dark tide, leaving behind communities that are shadows of their former selves. Yet even in this diminished world, life persists with a stubborn beauty that would bring tears to your eyes. Imagine, if you will, a moment of perfect tenderness. A young mother sitting by her cottage window, sunlight warming her face as she rocks her infant to sleep, her voice soft as silk weaving the same ancient lullaby her grandmother once sang to her. Somewhere in the village, you might hear that gentle voice carrying on the evening air, a melody passed down through generations like a golden thread connecting past to future. You might catch the sound of someone tending to animals with the kind of gentle care that speaks to the deep human need to nurture life, even when death seems to lurk around every corner. The people of 1351 didn't have the luxury of despair, dear listener. Survival demanded action, community, and an almost supernatural ability to find moments of joy in the midst of unimaginable hardship. Picture, if you will, a mother discovering her sick child's fever has finally broken. Imagine the tears of relief streaming down her weathered face as she feels that precious, cool forehead. They celebrated small victories with the intensity of people who understood that happiness might be fleeting, but was never undeserved. A successful harvest, a baby's first laugh, the recovery of a sick neighbor. These weren't just pleasant moments. They were miraculous affirmations that life somehow was still worth living. In this world, relationships carried a weight and sweetness that's difficult for us to comprehend today. Imagine the tender ritual of a medieval couple sharing their evening meal by candlelight, not because it was romantic, but because every shared moment had become sacred. When you might lose someone without warning, Every conversation became precious, every shared meal a gift, every moment of laughter a small rebellion against the darkness that threatened to consume everything. When you might lose someone without warning, every conversation became precious, every shared meal a gift, every moment of laughter a small rebellion against the darkness that threatened to consume everything. People held hands not just in affection, but in defiance of forces that would separate them forever. The skills these people possessed would astound you with their practical wisdom. They could read the sky like a book, predicting weather patterns that meant the difference between life and death. They could transform simple grains into bread that would nourish entire families, preserve meat without refrigeration, and create warmth from nothing more than wood and stone. They understood the healing properties of plants we now consider weeds, and they possessed an intuitive knowledge of how to live in harmony with the natural world that sustained them. Children in 1351 grew up fast, but they also grew up cherished in ways that would make your heart ache with their beauty. Every child who survived was seen as a gift, a promise that the future would continue despite everything that threatened to end it. These children learned early to find wonder in simple things, to appreciate the taste of fresh bread, the warmth of sunshine on their faces, the comfort of belonging to a community that would protect them with fierce dedication. The spiritual life of people in this era burned with an intensity that was both beautiful and heart-wrenching. Picture, if you will, a small stone chapel at twilight, warm candlelight flickering against ancient walls while voices joined together in quiet prayer. Not the grand cathedral services of peacetime, but intimate gatherings of souls seeking comfort in each other's presence. When earthly certainties crumbled, faith became a refuge and a source of strength that sustained entire communities. Churches weren't just buildings. They were gathering places where people came together to share their fears, their hopes, and their unshakable belief that somehow, beyond all understanding, everything would ultimately be all right. As you prepare to step outside your medieval dwelling and truly begin this journey through humanity's darkest year, remember that you're not just exploring history. You're discovering the incredible depths of human resilience, compassion, and hope that emerge when everything seems lost. The people of 1351 faced challenges that would test every fiber of human endurance. But they also discovered strengths they never knew they possessed. But before we explore what awaits outside your medieval dwelling, before we step into the streets of 1351 and witness both the heartbreak and the remarkable courage that defined this pivotal year in human history, we must prepare ourselves for a journey that will challenge everything we think we know about survival, community, and the incredible capacity of the human spirit to not just endure, but to create beauty even in the midst of darkness. This is part 1 of 12 in our gentle exploration of humanity's most transformative year. In the chapters that follow, we'll discover together how ordinary people accomplished extraordinary things, how communities found ways to care for one another when traditional systems failed, and how the darkest year in human history ultimately became the foundation for a renaissance that would change the world forever. Sleep peacefully tonight, dear listener, knowing that the same strength that carried humanity through 1351 flows through your veins as well. But now, let us step deeper into that world and discover what daily life truly meant for those who called 1351 home. Your first sensation isn't sight but smell. The earthy, damp fragrance of straw mingles with the faint trace of wood smoke that seems to cling to everything in this world. As your eyes adjust to the dim interior, you realize you're lying on what can only generously be called a bed. A simple wooden frame filled with straw, covered by a rough woolen blanket that scratches against your skin. The mattress beneath you crackles softly with every movement, a constant reminder that comfort, as you once knew it, has become a distant memory. Imagine, if you will, the gentle rustle of dried grass beneath you as you shift, trying to find a position that doesn't leave your bones aching. This straw bed, humble as it may seem, represents luxury for many in this medieval world. Picture yourself sinking slightly into this makeshift mattress, feeling the uneven texture through the thin fabric that separates you from the dry stalks below. The earthy scent rises around you like a natural perfume, grounding you in this ancient reality where even basic comfort required careful preparation and precious resources. The room around you tells its own story of survival and adaptation. Stone walls, thick and solid, rise up around you, their surface rough and uneven where skilled hands shaped each block. These walls, dear traveler, are not merely decorative. They are your fortress against the harsh realities of medieval life. Run your fingers along their cool surface and feel the slight dampness that seems to seep through even the thickest stone. This moisture, ever present in these times, created a constant battle between warmth and the relentless chill that sought to claim every corner of human habitation. Near one wall, a small fire pit has been carefully constructed, its stones blackened by countless fires. The pit represents more than warmth. It embodies the very essence of survival in this era. Picture the flickering flames that would dance here each evening, casting shadows that danced across the stone walls like ancient spirits. The fire pit, with its surrounding circle of carefully placed stones, speaks to generations of knowledge passed down through families who understood that fire meant the difference between life and death, when winter's icy grip tightened around their small world. The placement of every stone in that fire pit was deliberate, chosen to contain the flames while radiating maximum heat throughout the cramped space. The opening near the wall allowed smoke to escape through a carefully planned ventilation system, preventing the deadly accumulation of fumes that could silently claim an entire family during the long, dark nights of winter. Your dwelling, modest though it appears, represents months of careful planning and backbreaking labor. The wooden beams overhead, hewn from trees that may have stood for decades before yielding to the axe, support not just a roof, but the hopes and dreams of survival through another harsh season. Each beam was selected for its strength, its resistance to the elements, its ability to bear the weight of snow that would accumulate during the merciless winter months ahead. The single window, if you can call it that, consists of nothing more than an opening in the wall, perhaps covered by an animal skin or wooden shutter. Through this modest portal, the world outside beckons with both promise and peril. During daylight hours, precious illumination filters through, allowing you to tend to the countless tasks that fill every waking moment of medieval life. But as darkness falls, this same opening becomes a reminder of your vulnerability to the unknown dangers that lurk beyond these protective walls. Picture yourself moving through this space, learning to navigate its limitations and appreciate its simple functionality. Every item within these walls serves multiple purposes, for waste was a luxury that medieval people could not afford. That wooden bucket in the corner might serve for water collection during the day and storage during the night. The rough wooden table near the fire pit provides a surface for food preparation, a place for eating, and a workspace for the endless mending and crafting that sustained life in this challenging world. As you settle into this reality, imagine the sounds that would accompany your daily existence. The distant lowing of cattle reminds you that survival depends not just on shelter, but on the careful tending of animals that provide milk, meat, and the strength needed for farming. The soft murmur of voices from neighboring dwellings creates a comforting backdrop, a reminder that even in these harsh times, human community provided both practical support and emotional comfort against the overwhelming challenges of medieval life. The crackling of your fire pit creates a rhythm that becomes the heartbeat of your medieval existence. Listen to that gentle sound, dear traveler, and let it remind you of the countless generations who found solace in its warmth. The flames that dance before you carry the same ancient promise of comfort and safety that has sustained humanity through its darkest and most challenging periods. Your first meal in this world arrives as a revelation of simplicity and necessity. Perhaps a bowl of thick porridge, made from whatever grains survived the last harvest, seasoned with herbs grown in carefully tended gardens that represented the difference between health and illness. The wooden spoon in your hand, carved by skilled artisans from local wood, connects you to a tradition of craftsmanship where every tool was created to last for generations. The wooden spoon in your hand, carved by skilled artisans from local wood, connects you to a tradition of craftsmanship where every tool was created to last for generations. But even as you begin to appreciate the simple functionality of your new dwelling, even as the warmth from your fire pit begins to chase away the chill that seems to permeate every corner of this medieval world, you cannot shake the feeling that comfort and safety remain fragile commodities in this unforgiving era. The shadows that dance across your stone walls seem to whisper of challenges that extend far beyond the immediate concerns of warmth and shelter. Your neighbors, whose voices provide such comforting background to your daily existence, face the same daily struggle for survival that now defines your own reality. The community that surrounds you, while offering support and companionship, also carries within it the seeds of conflicts and dangers that could reshape your understanding of medieval life in ways you cannot yet imagine. As you drift towards sleep on your straw mattress, listening to the gentle crackling of your fire pit and the distant sounds of a world settling into nighttime routines, remember that your journey through medieval life has only just begun. The warmth and relative safety of your humble dwelling represent just the first layer of a complex world where survival depends on understanding forces and relationships that extend far beyond these protective stone walls. For while you have secured the basic necessities of shelter and warmth, while you have begun to appreciate the simple pleasures that medieval life can offer to those wise enough to recognize them, the true challenges of this era lie not within the safety of your dwelling, but in the complex web of relationships obligations, and dangers that define the broader medieval world. But survival needs are nothing compared to what lurks beyond these walls. The real test of your medieval existence is about to begin, and the lessons you'll learn will challenge everything you think you know about human nature, power, and the delicate balance between order and chaos that kept medieval society from descending into complete anarchy. Part 2 complete. The silence outside isn't peaceful. It's the kind of quiet that comes when life itself has retreated, when the very rhythms that once defined human existence have simply stopped. Imagine, if you will, walking through a countryside where the only sounds are your own footsteps and the whisper of wind through abandoned doorways. This was the reality that emerged as the Black Death tightened its grip on medieval Europe. The disease didn't just claim lives. It unraveled the very fabric of society, thread by careful thread, until entire communities found themselves adrift in a world they no longer recognized. Picture a typical manor in the English countryside, perhaps in the year 1348. For generations, this land had followed the same ancient patterns. The lord of the manor oversaw vast estates, while peasants worked the fields in a system so established it seemed as natural as the changing seasons. Every person knew their place, their duties, their neighbors. The social order was as solid as the stone walls of the manor house itself. But now, imagine those same fields lying fallow under the autumn sun, the harvest rotting where it stands, the manor house with its shutters drawn tight, and an eerie stillness where once there had been the constant bustle of daily life. The plague struck first at the foundation of medieval society, the family unit. Entire households would fall ill within days of each other, parents watching helplessly as their children succumbed to the mysterious ailment. Children left orphaned, wandering empty homes in search of familiar voices that would never answer again. The bonds that held families together for generations were severed in a matter of weeks. Without families, the larger social structures began to crumble. Feudalism, that intricate web of obligations and loyalties that defined medieval life, depended entirely on people being present to fulfill their roles. When the local blacksmith died, who would shoe the horses? When the village priest perished, who would perform the sacraments that marked the rhythm of life and death? When entire families of farmers vanished, who would tend the crops that fed the community? The breakdown wasn't just practical, it was deeply psychological. For centuries, people had defined themselves by their relationships to others. A serf knew who he was because he served a particular lord. A lord understood his identity through his obligations to his king and his vassals. When those people began disappearing, the survivors faced not just physical hardship, but an existential crisis that struck at the very core of their being. Consider the story of a young woman named Agnes, perhaps the daughter of a village baker. In the world before the plague, her path through life was clearly defined. She would marry a local craftsman, bear children, help run the family business, and eventually pass down her skills to the next generation. Her identity was woven into the community like thread in a tapestry. But as the Black Death swept through her village, Agnes watched that tapestry unravel. Her father died first, then her mother, then her younger brothers. The young man she was meant to marry succumbed to the fever in the spring. One by one, the faces that had defined her world disappeared, leaving her standing alone in a shop that no longer had customers, in a village that no longer had neighbors. Agnes was not unique. Across Europe, millions of people found themselves in similar circumstances, adrift in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. The social bonds that had once seemed unbreakable proved fragile as morning frost when confronted with such overwhelming loss. The religious community, which had long provided both spiritual guidance and practical support, found itself equally devastated. Parish priests, who lived among their congregations and tended to the sick, died at catastrophic rates. Monasteries, which had served as centers of learning and charity, saw their populations decimated. The church, which had been a pillar of stability for 1,000 years, suddenly found itself struggling to maintain even basic services. In many regions, the breakdown became so complete that the dead outnumbered the living. Villages that had thrived for centuries were simply abandoned, their empty houses slowly reclaimed by vegetation. Fields that had been carefully cultivated for generations returned to wilderness. Roads that had connected communities fell into disrepair as there were no longer enough people to maintain them. Yet even in this darkest chapter of human history, something remarkable began to emerge. As the old social structures crumbled, survivors like Agnes began to form new kinds of communities. Without the rigid hierarchies of feudalism to constrain them, people started to forge bonds based on immediate need and mutual support, rather than ancient obligations. Small groups of survivors would band together, pooling their resources and skills to create makeshift families. A widowed farmer might join forces with an orphaned child and a displaced craftsman, creating a new kind of household that would have been unthinkable in the rigid social order of pre-plague Europe. These new communities were fragile, temporary, and often heartbreakingly brief, but they represented something profound, the irrepressible human drive to connect, to care for one another, even in the face of overwhelming loss. In the ruins of the old world, people discovered capacities they never knew they possessed. A nobleman's daughter might learn to work in the fields. A serf might find himself making decisions about land management that had previously been the exclusive domain of his betters. Children orphaned by the plague developed a resilience and independence that would have been impossible in the protective cocoon of traditional family life. These transformations weren't always smooth or peaceful. The breakdown of social order also unleashed darker impulses. Without the structures that had traditionally maintained peace, some communities descended into chaos. Desperate people sometimes turned to banditry or violence. The weakening of religious authority led to the rise of fanatical movements that blamed various groups for the plague. But perhaps most remarkably, many communities found ways to rebuild on new foundations. Towns that had lost their traditional leaders elected new councils. Villages developed innovative ways of managing common resources. Trade networks, disrupted by the massive population losses, gradually reformed along different routes and with different participants. The Black Death had torn away the old world like a violent storm stripping leaves from a tree. But trees, when they survive such storms, often grow back stronger, their roots deeper, their branches reaching in new directions toward the light. As we settle into our cozy corner of history tonight, we can hardly imagine the courage it must have taken for those medieval survivors to face each new dawn, to wake up in a world that had been so fundamentally altered, to find the strength to plant new seeds in soil that had been watered with so many tears. The social fabric that had seemed so permanent, so unshakable, had proven to be as fragile as spider's silk in a hurricane. Yet the human spirit, that remarkable capacity to adapt, to rebuild, to find meaning even in the midst of chaos, had proven to be far more resilient than anyone could have imagined. Yet the true horror isn't social, it's biological. Beyond the collapse of communities and the dissolution of ancient bonds lies something far more immediate and terrifying. The disease itself, with its mysterious ways and inevitable march through every corner of human existence. The smell that woke you carries more than unpleasantness. It whispers of danger creeping through the narrow streets, seeping under doorways, and settling into the very fabric of daily life. It whispers of danger creeping through the narrow streets, seeping under doorways, and settling into the very fabric of daily life. This isn't just the scent of unwashed bodies or rotting food, though those are certainly present. No, this is something far more sinister, something that makes even the bravest souls pull their cloaks tighter and quicken their pace through the cobblestone alleys. Imagine, if you will, waking up in a world where each morning brings the possibility that today might be your last healthy day. The bubonic plague, as history would later name it, moved through medieval communities like a dark tide, and the signs were unmistakable once you learned to recognize them. Picture yourself as a merchant in a bustling market town, someone who deals with travelers and traders from distant lands. You've heard whispers of a strange sickness in far-off places, but such rumors are common. Disease is as much a part of life as sunrise and sunset. But then the first victim appears in your community, and everything changes. The plague announced itself with a cruel efficiency that medieval physicians couldn't comprehend. It began often with what seemed like a simple fever, nothing more concerning than what you might expect after a cold night or a day of hard labor. But within hours, sometimes less, the fever would spike dramatically. Bodies would burn from within while victims shivered uncontrollably, their teeth chattering like autumn leaves in a fierce wind. Picture a young blacksmith named Thomas, strong arms accustomed to working the forge, suddenly unable to lift his hammer. The fever grips him so completely that even the warmth of his own fire feels like ice against his skin. His wife, Margaret, tries to comfort him with cool cloths and gentle words. But she notices something troubling. Small dark spots are beginning to appear on his skin, like ink blots spreading across parchment. These weren't ordinary bruises or marks from his work. These were the herald of something far more terrifying. The swellings came next, and they were impossible to ignore. Imagine tender, painful lumps appearing in the most vulnerable places where your body's defenses gathered. The lymph nodes under your arms, in your groin, along your neck. These weren't small irritations you could dismiss or hide beneath clothing. They grew to the size of eggs, sometimes larger, throbbing with each heartbeat like a second pulse determined to be heard. Picture, if you will, how even in these dark moments, love found ways to express itself. Margaret's gentle hands offering cool compresses, her whispered words of comfort cutting through the fever's delirium like stars piercing a stormy night. Medieval people called them buboes, and once they appeared, everyone knew what they meant. Picture the fear in Margaret's eyes as she discovers these telltale swellings on Thomas's body. In that moment, their world shrinks to the size of their small cottage. Because she knows, with a certainty that chills her soul, that the pestilence has found them. The pain was extraordinary. These swellings weren't just uncomfortable, they were agony incarnate. Thomas, who could work red-hot iron without flinching, now whimpers at the slightest touch. The buboes become so sensitive that even the weight of a linen shirt feels like torture. Sleep becomes impossible, not just from the pain, but from the fever that climbs higher each day, bringing with it delirium and hallucinations that blur the line between nightmare and reality. Imagine lying in your bed, burning with fever while your mind conjures visions of shadowy figures at your window, or hearing voices of loved ones who died years ago calling your name. The plague didn't just attack the body, it invaded the mind, leaving victims trapped in a world where reality and terror merged into one endless, feverish dream. Yet perhaps most frightening was how quickly it all happened. This wasn't a slow decline that gave families time to prepare or seek help. The plague moved with the speed of wildfire through dry grass. This wasn't a slow decline that gave families time to prepare or seek help. The plague moved with the speed of wildfire through dry grass. The plague moved with the speed of wildfire through dry grass. A person could wake up feeling perfectly healthy and be dead before the sun set. Picture the helplessness Margaret feels as Thomas deteriorates before her eyes, his strong body betraying him in ways that seem impossible. The community's response was swift, but often tragically misguided. Picture the local priest arriving at their door, not to offer last rites, but to warn Margaret about the dangers of remaining with her husband. The prevailing wisdom, such as it was, suggested that the disease spread through corrupted air, through the very breath of the infected. Some believed it came from looking into the eyes of a victim, while others thought it traveled on the wind from distant, unholy places. Imagine the agonizing choice Margaret faces: stay with the man she loves and risk her own life, or abandon him in his hour of greatest need to protect herself and potentially others. This wasn't just one family's dilemma. It played out in countless homes across Europe as the plague carved its devastating path through the continent. The medical understanding of the time, limited as it was, attempted to make sense of this incomprehensible horror. Picture learned physicians, dressed in their protective robes and bird-like masks filled with herbs and spices, examining victims while maintaining what they hoped was a safe distance. They spoke of imbalanced humors, of corrupted air rising from swamps or created by unusual planetary alignments. Some blamed earthquakes for releasing poisonous vapors from the Earth's core. These explanations, while incorrect, reflected a desperate human need to understand and therefore potentially control this invisible enemy. But the plague cared nothing for medical theories or protective rituals. It continued its relentless advance, claiming rich and poor, young and old, learned and ignorant with equal efficiency. The mortality rate was staggering. Picture a community where 8 out of every 10 people who contracted the plague simply died. There was no gradual recovery, no long convalescence. People either survived, usually within a week of the first symptoms, or they didn't. The speed and certainty of death created a psychological terror that went far beyond the physical suffering. Imagine the silence that began to settle over affected communities. The cheerful greetings between neighbors stopped. Markets grew quiet as vendors and customers alike wondered who might be carrying the invisible seeds of destruction. Children, always sensitive to the moods of adults, began to play more quietly, their laughter replaced by an unnatural solemnity that spoke to the fear that had settled over their world like morning mist that never lifts. Yet even in this landscape of terror, something remarkable emerged. As Margaret tends to Thomas through his final days, she discovers a love deeper than anything she had ever known. Stripped of all the small concerns and daily irritations that once seemed so important, she finds herself focused entirely on bringing comfort to the person who matters most to her in the world. Their conversations, punctuated by his fever-driven delirium, become achingly precious. She memorizes every word, every moment of lucidity when his eyes clear and he speaks her name with recognition and tenderness. In those brief intervals between the waves of fever, they pack a lifetime of devotion into whispered words and gentle touches. The plague, for all its horror, revealed the extraordinary depths of human compassion. Picture neighbors who risked their own lives to bring soup to the sick, priests who stay to comfort the dying even as their colleagues flee, and children who show remarkable bravery in caring for parents who can no longer care for themselves. In communities where medical knowledge failed, love became medicine. Where science offered no answers, faith provided comfort. Where reason crumbled, the human heart proved stronger than any disease. The Black Death may have conquered bodies with ruthless efficiency, but it could not touch the spirit that connected people to each other and to something larger than their own mortality. As Margaret holds Thomas's hand through his final hours, listening to his labored breathing gradually quiet into the profound stillness that follows, she understands something that would sustain her through the dark months ahead. The plague might claim his body, but it could never diminish the love they had shared or the strength she had discovered within herself. The disease had indeed found them, had done its worst, had taken what seemed most precious. But in that small cottage, surrounded by the evidence of devastating loss, something had also been born, a deeper understanding of what it means to be truly human in the face of forces beyond our control. But even if you avoid the pestilence, hunger awaits. For in a world where the very foundations of society are crumbling, where those who plant and harvest and distribute food are falling victim to disease, the most basic necessity of life itself becomes a daily battle for survival. Your stomach speaks a language that needs no translation. The gnawing emptiness that wakes you each morning, the sharp pangs that pierce your concentration during the day, and the hollow ache that follows you into your dreams at night. This is the vocabulary of hunger in the year 1351, and it's a lesson that almost everyone in Europe is learning with devastating clarity. Imagine, if you will, standing in what was once a thriving market square, the cobblestones, worn smooth by countless feet carrying abundance from farm to table, now echo with an emptiness that seems to amplify every sound. Where vendors once called out their wares in cheerful competition, where the air once carried the rich aromas of fresh bread, roasted meats, and seasonal fruits. Now there are only scattered remnants of commerce struggling to survive. But now, as the Great Dying continues its relentless march across the continent, you're learning harsh truths about the fragile web that connects soil to table, farmer to family. The immediate cause isn't just the plague claiming lives, though that's certainly devastating enough. The crisis runs deeper, woven into the very fabric of medieval agriculture. Picture, if you will, standing at the edge of what was once a thriving wheat field. Imagine the ghostly whisper of wind through abandoned furrows where golden grain should wave in summer sunshine. The farmers who would normally be preparing soil, planting seeds, and carefully tending crops through the growing season, have either perished or fled to cities in desperate search of work and safety. These empty fields stretch like open wounds across the countryside, silent testimony to the intricate web of human knowledge that has been lost. Consider a woman named Sarah, perhaps a baker's widow, who once kneaded dough for an entire village. Before the plague, her small shop was a hub of daily life. People would stop by for their morning bread, exchange news, and plan their days around the reliable rhythm of fresh loaves cooling on wooden shelves. But now, as she stares at the nearly empty grain sacks in her storeroom, Sarah faces a mathematics of survival that would have been unthinkable just months before. The grain that remains is no longer the plump, golden wheat she once took for granted. What little wheat survives is often contaminated, mixed with chaff and seeds that previous generations would have fed only to animals. But when hunger gnaws at your belly with increasing insistence, the distinctions between food fit for humans and food fit for beasts begin to blur with disturbing speed. Picture Sarah's calloused hands working with ingredients she never imagined using. Acorns, carefully processed to remove their bitter tannins, are ground into a coarse flour that gives bread a heavy, earthy taste. Dried peas, beans, and whatever vegetables survived the last harvest are mixed into doughs that stretch precious grain as far as possible. Even tree bark, prepared with techniques passed down through whispered conversations among desperate neighbors, finds its way into loaves that bear little resemblance to the bread of more fortunate times. But this is more than just a story about changing recipes. This is about the complete breakdown of systems that had sustained life for generations. Imagine, if you will, walking along a once bustling trade road now overgrown with weeds. Where merchant caravans used to pass weekly, picture the silence where there should be creaking wagon wheels and the cheerful calls of traders. Coastal towns that once thrived on fishing find their harbors eerily quiet, not because the sea has changed, but because so many of the skilled fishermen have succumbed to the plague. The very networks that had connected communities for centuries now lay broken like severed arteries. The class distinctions that once seemed so permanent become starkly visible in times of scarcity. Picture the lord of a manor, accustomed to dining on white bread made from carefully sifted flour, now discovering that even his privileged position can't conjure food from empty granaries. Yet he still fares better than the peasants who once worked his lands, for he has stores of preserved meat, access to what little grain remains, and the power to claim what resources still exist. But imagine the moral weight of such choices. Yet he still fares better than the peasants who once worked his lands, for he has stores of preserved meat, access to what little grain remains, and the power to claim what resources still exist. But imagine the moral weight of such choices. When there isn't enough food to sustain everyone, who decides who eats and who doesn't? Picture Sarah standing in her bakery before dawn, her breath visible in the cold air as she stares at 3 small bags of precious grain. Imagine the weight of that moment as she calculates how to divide her dwindling supplies among the faces that will appear at her door. The mother with 3 young children, eyes hollow with worry. The elderly man whose sons died in the spring, now surviving on the kindness of neighbors. The young couple who might yet have children if they survive. Each face represents not just hunger, but hope that rests in her weathered hands. These aren't abstract ethical dilemmas discussed in comfortable rooms by well-fed philosophers. These are life and death decisions made by ordinary people, who find themselves with the terrible power to determine who lives and who doesn't. Picture the weight of such responsibility, settling on Sarah's shoulders as she measures out portions that she knows are too small, yet represent all she can afford to give. The ingenuity born from desperation reveals itself in countless small innovations. Picture communities developing new preservation techniques, finding ways to make summer's modest harvest last through winter's long darkness. Imagine, if you will, the satisfied exhaustion of villagers after completing a new root cellar deeper than any they've dug before, lined with stones and straw, a fortress against winter's hunger. Herbs that were once used primarily for flavor become precious medicines and preservatives, their earthy fragrances filling cottages like hope made tangible. Knowledge that might have been passed down casually from grandmother to granddaughter becomes vital wisdom shared with the urgency of survival, each recipe and technique a lifeline thrown between generations. Even in the depths of hunger, something beautiful emerges in the form of radical sharing. Picture a community where the traditional boundaries between families begin to dissolve. When everyone is hungry, the pretense of individual prosperity becomes meaningless. Neighbors who might have once eyed each other's gardens with mild envy now work together to make every scrap of food count. Sarah might find herself sharing her last loaf with strangers, not out of boundless generosity, but because she understands that survival has become a community endeavor. When one person falls to starvation, the whole group becomes more vulnerable. When everyone shares what little they have, there's at least a chance that some will survive to see better times. Picture the children of this era, growing up with an appreciation for food that their predecessors could never have imagined. A single apple becomes a treasure to be savored slowly, each bite examined and appreciated with the intensity of a religious experience. These children, if they survive, will carry with them for life an understanding of abundance and scarcity that will make them grateful for every meal, no matter how simple. The spiritual dimension of hunger reveals itself in unexpected ways. Picture Sarah's small bakery becoming not just a place of commerce, but a sanctuary where people gather to share not just scarce food, but stories, hopes, and prayers. The act of breaking bread together, even when the bread is coarse and the portions small, creates bonds between people that transcend the normal social hierarchies. In times of plenty, eating is often a solitary or casual act. But when food is scarce, every meal becomes communal, sacred, charged with meaning. Picture families gathering around their simple tables with a gravity and gratitude that transforms even the humblest turnip soup into something approaching the divine. The hunger doesn't just affect bodies. It reshapes minds and spirits in ways both terrible and profound. Physical weakness makes every task more difficult, every decision more crucial. But it also strips away the non-essential, forcing people to focus on what truly matters: survival, community, love for those closest to them. As night falls and Sarah banks the fires in her ovens, preparing for another day of impossible choices and precious small victories, she understands something that prosperity had hidden from her. Hunger, for all its cruelty, has revealed the extraordinary capacity for human beings to adapt, to share, to find meaning even in the midst of deprivation. The gnawing emptiness in her stomach speaks not just of personal need, but of a community learning to survive together. And in that solidarity, in the shared determination to endure until better times return, there's a kind of nourishment that no amount of grain could provide. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new impossible choices about how to distribute too little among too many. But it will also bring opportunities for the kind of generosity and courage that only emerges when everything seems lost. Yet the human spirit refuses to surrender. But even as communities learn to share scarce food and find strength in solidarity, another challenge emerges that strikes at something just as fundamental as hunger: the basic human need for cleanliness and dignity in how we present ourselves to the world. Your clothing tells a story you never intended to write. The fabric that touches your skin, once soft from careful washing and gentle wear, now bears the accumulated weight of months without proper cleaning. Yet imagine, if you will, how even these worn garments can become symbols of resilience, each patch and mend a testament to your determination to maintain dignity. Each careful repair an act of hope that tomorrow will come. The tunic that once marked you as a respectable member of your community now carries stains that speak of tasks you never imagined you'd need to perform, of compromises with cleanliness that previous generations would have found unthinkable. Imagine, if you will, waking up to the morning chill seeping through gaps in fabric that has grown thin from constant wear. The wool that once provided warmth and comfort now scratches against skin that hasn't been properly bathed in weeks. This isn't just discomfort, dear traveler. This is the gradual erosion of one of the things that separates humans from other creatures: our ability to maintain ourselves with dignity and care. Picture yourself attempting what was once a simple morning routine. In better times, you might have begun each day by washing your face and hands with clean water, perhaps heated over a fire that burned steadily through the night. Your clothes, while simple, would have been clean and mended. Your hair, though styled simply by modern standards, would have been combed and arranged with care. But now, as you reach for the small basin that once held fresh water, you find it contains only a few precious drops that must serve multiple purposes. Do you use this water to clean your face, to rinse your mouth, or to dampen a cloth for cleaning the eating bowl you'll need for the day's meager meal? These aren't choices anyone should have to make, yet they've become part of the daily mathematics of survival. The soap that once seemed so common has become a luxury beyond reach. Picture Sarah, the baker we met earlier, trying to clean her hands after a day of working with whatever ingredients she could find. The fine ash and rendered fat that once combined to create cleansing soap are now either unavailable or too precious to use for cleaning when they could be used for food or warmth. She rubs her hands with coarse sand or rough cloth, removing the obvious dirt but never quite achieving the cleanliness that once came so naturally. Consider the deeper implications of this seemingly small change. In medieval society, cleanliness wasn't just about comfort. It was about social standing, about respect for yourself and others, about participating in community life with dignity. Picture the gradual way that standards shift when everyone faces the same constraints. How what was once unacceptable slowly becomes normal, then inevitable. The clothes on your back represent an investment that would astound people from more abundant times. That rough woolen tunic, patched and repatched, mended with thread that doesn't quite match, represents months of labor by skilled hands. The clothes on your back represent an investment that would astound people from more abundant times. That rough woolen tunic, patched and repatched, mended with thread that doesn't quite match, represents months of labor by skilled hands. The fabric was woven on looms operated by craftspeople whose knowledge had been passed down through generations. The thread was spun from wool sheared from sheep that had to be fed and protected through harsh seasons. Picture yourself learning to see clothing with completely different eyes. That small tear in your sleeve isn't just an inconvenience to be quickly repaired. It's a potential disaster that could lead to losing a garment that can't be replaced. You learn to move more carefully, to avoid thorns and rough surfaces, to treat every piece of fabric as the precious resource it truly is. But consider, too, the ingenuity that emerges from such constraints. Picture communities developing new techniques for extending the life of clothing. Old garments are carefully taken apart, their usable pieces combined to create new clothes for children or patched into existing garments for adults. Nothing is wasted. Even the smallest scraps of fabric find uses as patches, cleaning cloths, or padding for worn shoes. The washing of clothes becomes a community event charged with both practical necessity and social meaning. Picture the banks of a stream where women gather not just to clean their family's few garments, but to share news, offer mutual support, and maintain the bonds that hold their damaged communities together. The work is harder now, soap is scarce, clean water sometimes distant, and the clothes themselves are more fragile from constant wear. Imagine the careful choreography of such washing days. Each family's clothes must be cleaned without using too much of the precious soap or taking up too much space along the water's edge. Women who might have once competed over whose laundry was whitest and brightest now collaborate to share techniques for removing stains with materials available to everyone. Ash for certain types of soil, particular plants for different kinds of marks, careful timing to take advantage of the sun's natural bleaching power. Your hair, once washed regularly with warm water and sweet-smelling herbs, now must be maintained with methods that would have seemed primitive in better times. Picture yourself learning to clean your hair with dry methods, brushing it carefully with natural bristle brushes to remove dirt and distribute the natural oils that keep hair healthy. Herbs that grow wild near your community become precious allies. Rosemary for cleanliness, mint for freshness, chamomile for softness. The maintenance of personal hygiene becomes an exercise in creativity and careful resource management. Picture small innovations that emerge from necessity. Using clean sand as an abrasive for cleaning teeth when proper tooth cleaning sticks are unavailable. developing techniques for cleaning ears and nails with tools carved from wood or bone, learning which plants can provide natural deodorizing properties when soap is impossible to obtain. But perhaps most significantly, picture how the definition of cleanliness itself begins to shift. What was once unacceptable becomes merely unfortunate. What was once unfortunate becomes normal. What was once normal becomes, in these constrained times, almost luxurious. Communities develop new social norms around cleanliness that allow people to maintain dignity, even when they can't maintain previous standards of hygiene. Consider a young mother trying to keep her children clean and presentable. Picture her careful rationing of water, her creative use of available materials, her gentle persistence in maintaining routines that give her children some sense of normalcy, even as the world around them transforms beyond recognition. She might not be able to bathe them as frequently or as thoroughly as she once did, but she can still comb their hair with care, still check that their clothes are arranged neatly, still teach them the importance of taking care of themselves even under difficult circumstances. The social aspects of appearance take on new meaning when everyone faces similar constraints. Picture community gatherings where no one expects perfection, where the effort to maintain dignity matters more than the results, where people support each other's attempts to remain human in the face of dehumanizing circumstances. The person who appears with carefully mended clothes and clean hands is praised not for wealth or superior resources, but for persistence and self-respect. Even intimate relationships are affected by these changes in hygiene and appearance. Picture couples learning new forms of tenderness that accommodate the realities of their situation. The gentle help with difficult-to-reach areas during limited washing opportunities, the sharing of scarce cleaning supplies, the patient assistance with mending clothes that have become too precious to risk damaging through careless repair. As you settle into sleep wearing clothes that carry the day's accumulation of work and worry, picture the dreams that might come to someone whose waking life has been so changed from what they once expected. Perhaps you dream of long, warm baths in clean water, of fresh clothes that smell like sunshine and soap, of a time when cleanliness was so easily achieved it was taken for granted. But perhaps, too, you dream of the unexpected strength you've discovered in yourself and your community. The ability to maintain dignity without perfect cleanliness, to find beauty in people whose external circumstances don't meet previous standards, to understand that true respect comes not from spotless appearances, but from the courage to persist with grace under impossible circumstances. The morning will bring another day of careful choices about how to use limited water, precious soap, and increasingly fragile clothing. But it will also bring opportunities to demonstrate the kind of resilience and community spirit that transforms survival from mere endurance into a form of quiet heroism that would inspire generations yet to come. As you navigate this transformed world of limited resources and changed standards, you're about to discover that maintaining physical cleanliness and dignified appearance, challenging as they are, pale in comparison to the complex social navigation required to build trust and connection in a world where traditional bonds have been shattered by loss and fear. Imagine, if you will, standing at the edge of what was once a bustling village square, now populated by strangers who have become your neighbors through shared tragedy rather than shared history. The familiar faces that once defined your social world have been replaced by people whose stories you don't know, whose customs might differ from your own, whose very presence represents both the hope of community and the uncertainty of the unknown. Picture yourself as someone who once knew exactly where you belonged in the intricate web of medieval social relationships. Perhaps you were the baker's daughter who married the blacksmith's son, linking two established families in networks of obligation and support that stretched back generations. Your identity was clear, your relationships defined by traditions so ancient they seem natural as the changing seasons. But now, as Sarah, let's say she has become our guide through this strange new world. Now Sarah finds herself in conversations with people she would never have spoken to in the old social order. The nobleman's widow who fled her estate when the plague claimed her family. The foreign merchant stranded when trade routes collapsed. The young priest whose parish dissolved around him, leaving him to wander between communities offering whatever spiritual comfort he can provide. The language barriers alone present challenges that the old, stable communities never faced. Picture trying to communicate essential information about food sharing, work assignments, or safety concerns with people who speak different dialects or come from regions with entirely different customs. Hand gestures that seem friendly in one culture might be offensive in another. Religious practices that provide comfort to some might seem strange or even threatening to others. Consider the delicate process of building trust when everyone has reason to be suspicious. Picture Sarah encountering a family that arrived from a plague-devastated city. carrying with them not just their few possessions, but also the potential for disease. The reasonable part of her mind understands that they're probably healthy. They've survived the journey after all, and show no obvious signs of illness, but the fearful part whispers about the invisible dangers they might carry, the disruption their presence might bring to the fragile stability her remaining community has achieved. Yet hunger and practical necessity force interactions that might never have occurred in times of abundance. Picture Sarah discovering that the foreign merchant knows techniques for preserving meat that could help the community's food supplies last longer. The nobleman's widow, for all her different social background, has strong hands and a willingness to work that the community desperately needs. The wandering priest carries news from other regions that could be vital for planning and survival. The social codes that once governed interaction, who could speak to whom, under what circumstances, with what level of formality, prove inadequate for these new circumstances. Picture the awkward dance of trying to establish new norms that allow cooperation while maintaining some sense of dignity and respect for everyone involved. How do you address someone whose social rank was once far above your own, but who now depends on the community for the same basic necessities you do? Trust becomes a currency more precious than any coin, but it must be earned through actions rather than inherited through family connections or social position. Picture Sarah gradually learning that the foreign merchant shares his food fairly, that the nobleman's widow never takes more than her share, that the wandering priest offers comfort to everyone regardless of their background. These observations, accumulated over days and weeks, slowly build the foundation for new kinds of relationships. But consider, too, the psychological challenges of letting strangers into your emotional world when loss has made you cautious about forming new attachments. Picture Sarah's hesitation as she finds herself genuinely liking the merchant's quick wit, or feeling maternal concern for the nobleman's young daughter. The part of her that has learned to expect loss warns against caring too deeply, while the part that remembers the warmth of community connection yearns for the comfort that comes from belonging to something larger than herself. The children, as they often do, lead the way in breaking down barriers that seem insurmountable to adults. Picture young ones who begin playing together despite their different backgrounds, creating games that bridge language barriers, sharing the small treasures that children always manage to find, even in the direst circumstances. Their laughter becomes a common language that helps adults remember their own capacity for joy and connection. Religious differences that might have seemed crucial in more settled times become secondary to shared human needs. Picture communal prayers where Christian, Jewish, and pagan traditions blend into something new. Not a rejection of individual beliefs, but a recognition that the divine, however understood, calls people to care for one another. The wandering priest might lead a Christian prayer, while the foreign merchant offers blessings in his own tradition, and both are accepted as genuine expressions of hope and community. The process of establishing new social hierarchies based on contribution rather than birth creates both opportunities and tensions. Picture the discussions, sometimes heated, about how to organize work, distribute resources, and make decisions that affect everyone. The nobleman's widow might have experience in managing large households, but does that qualify her to lead a community of equals? The merchant might understand trade and negotiation, but can his methods work when everyone is struggling to survive? The nobleman's widow might have experience in managing large households, but does that qualify her to lead a community of equals? Picture Sarah finding her own voice in these discussions, discovering leadership abilities she never knew she possessed. Her experience managing the bakery, her knowledge of the local area, her relationships with longtime residents, these become valuable assets in building bridges between old and new community members. She learns to mediate disputes, to facilitate conversations between people who might not otherwise understand each other, to recognize when someone is contributing more than their fair share, and when someone needs extra support. The establishment of new traditions becomes essential for creating a sense of shared identity. Picture the community developing rituals that honor both their losses and their hopes. Perhaps they create a weekly gathering where people share stories about their lives before the plague, helping everyone understand the rich histories that each person brings to their new shared life. Or they might establish work routines that ensure everyone has opportunities to contribute according to their abilities, while also learning new skills from others. Trust is built through small acts of reliability repeated over time. Picture Sarah keeping track of the subtle ways people demonstrate their commitment to the community. The merchant who always shows up for his assigned work shifts, the widow who offers to take on extra tasks when others are ill, the priest who mediates disputes with fairness and wisdom. These observations help her understand who can be counted on when circumstances become even more difficult. But picture, too, the inevitable tensions and disappointments that arise when people from different backgrounds try to forge new communities under stress. Misunderstandings about work expectations, conflicts over resource allocation, personality clashes that might have been easily resolved in more stable times, but become magnified when everyone is operating at the edge of their emotional and physical resources. The art of social navigation in this new world requires a combination of openness and caution, generosity and self-protection, hope for human goodness, and realistic acknowledgement of human limitations. Picture Sarah learning to extend trust gradually, to give people opportunities to prove themselves while protecting the community from those who might take advantage of their vulnerability. As seasons change and the community that has formed around shared necessity begins to develop its own culture and traditions, picture the deep satisfaction that comes from successfully building something positive from the ruins of what was lost. These aren't just survival relationships, they're becoming genuine friendships, working partnerships, and chosen family connections that might prove even stronger than the blood and marriage ties that once defined social life. The evening conversations around shared fires reveal the depth of these developing relationships. The accelerated timeline of crisis has compressed the normal process of relationship building, creating bonds forged in shared hardship and mutual dependence. But as these new social connections stabilize and strengthen, you begin to realize that survival requires more than just personal relationships and community cooperation. In a world where traditional systems of trade and economy have collapsed, you must learn entirely new ways of thinking about value, exchange, and the work that sustains life. In this transformed world, your survival depends not just on what you know, but on what you can offer to others. The coins that once jingled in merchants' purses have lost much of their meaning when there's little to buy and fewer people to sell. Picture yourself holding a silver piece that might have once purchased a week's worth of bread, now worth perhaps a single meal if you can find anyone with food to spare. Imagine, if you will, the quiet dignity of a merchant who discovers that his true wealth lies not in his diminished purse, but in his ability to bring hope and practical solutions to desperate neighbors. Imagine, if you will, standing in what was once a thriving marketplace, where the old economics of supply and demand have been replaced by something far more immediate and human. The elaborate systems of credit, debt, and future promises that once lubricated medieval commerce have given way to the most basic form of exchange. I have something you need. You have something I need. Let's help each other survive another day. Picture Sarah, our baker, discovering that her most valuable asset isn't the small amount of grain she's managed to preserve, but the knowledge in her hands and mind. The techniques for turning whatever edible materials are available into nourishing bread have become more precious than gold. Communities that might have once taken bakers for granted now understand that the difference between eating and starving often lies in the skills that transform raw ingredients into sustenance. But consider how the definition of valuable work has expanded beyond anything the old economy might have recognized. Picture a young man who was once perhaps a scribe or minor clerk, now discovering that his ability to read and calculate makes him essential for managing the complex logistics of resource sharing. When survival depends on careful rationing and fair distribution, someone who can keep accurate records and perform calculations becomes as vital as someone who can grow food or build shelter. The barter economy that emerges isn't the simple trading of obvious goods that you might expect. Picture instead a complex web of interdependence where services often matter more than objects. Sarah might trade a day's worth of bread making not for grain, but for someone to repair the roof of the bakehouse before winter rains make it unusable. The person who fixes her roof might accept bread as payment, but what they really need is someone to teach their children basic letters and numbers. Imagine the delicate negotiations involved in these new forms of exchange. Without standardized currency or established price structures, every transaction becomes a conversation about value, need, and fairness. These negotiations reveal something beautiful about human nature, the tendency toward fairness even under desperate circumstances. Picture community members developing informal but strict codes about equitable exchange, where taking advantage of someone's desperation is seen not just as unkind, but as a threat to everyone's survival. When you depend on the same people for your continued existence, short-term exploitation becomes self-defeating stupidity. The concept of wealth transforms completely in this new reality. Picture the nobleman's widow discovering that her inherited jewelry, once symbols of status and security, have become merely pretty objects with little practical value. But her knowledge of managing large households, her experience in organizing complex projects, her ability to mediate between people of different social backgrounds, these skills prove invaluable in ways that precious stones never could. Consider how work itself takes on new meaning when it's directly connected to community survival. Picture people discovering satisfaction in jobs they never would have chosen in better times. The former clerk who learns to preserve meat, the merchant who becomes skilled at repairing tools, the widow who develops expertise in treating minor injuries and illnesses. The immediate connection between their labor and their neighbor's well-being creates a sense of purpose that purely commercial work might never have provided. Picture the innovative solutions that emerge when traditional job categories become meaningless. Someone who was once a candle maker might discover that their knowledge of working with wax and oils translates perfectly to creating waterproof treatments for clothing and containers. A person who raised ornamental birds might find that their understanding of animal husbandry makes them valuable in caring for the few chickens or goats that represent the community's protein sources. The development of new currencies based on practical need rather than abstract value creates fascinating dynamics. Picture communities where a day's worth of skilled labor becomes a standard unit of exchange, where promises of future work are given and accepted as readily as coins once were, where reputation for reliability becomes the most valuable asset anyone can possess. But consider, too, the challenges of this new economy. Picture the difficulties that arise when someone becomes ill and cannot fulfill their promised work obligations, or when disagreements arise about the relative value of different types of labor. The merchant might argue that his knowledge of trade routes is worth more than Sarah's bread making, while Sarah contends that people can travel new routes but can't survive without food. The resolution of such disputes often becomes a community process rather than an individual negotiation. Picture evening gatherings where people discuss not just immediate work assignments, but longer-term questions about how to value different contributions fairly. These conversations become exercises in practical philosophy, exploring questions about human worth, community responsibility, and fair exchange that scholars in more prosperous times might debate abstractly. Picture the ingenious ways communities develop to handle the complexity of multi-party exchanges. When Sarah needs her roof repaired, the roofer needs his tools sharpened, the tool sharpener needs clothing mended, and the seamstress needs bread. The community might organize work exchanges that ensure everyone's needs are met through a coordinated series of contributions. The question of supporting those who cannot contribute equally, the very young, the elderly, the chronically ill, reveals the moral foundation of these new economic relationships. Picture communities making collective decisions about care for their most vulnerable members, understanding that today's strong worker might be tomorrow's person in need of support. These decisions aren't just practical. They're expressions of the values that will define who they become as a people. Time takes on different meaning in this economy, where immediate survival often conflicts with long-term planning. Picture Sarah, trying to balance the need to use her remaining grain for today's bread against the wisdom of saving some for seed that might produce next year's harvest. These aren't just personal decisions. They're community choices about whether to focus on surviving the immediate crisis or investing in the possibility of future abundance. The knowledge economy becomes as important as the exchange of physical goods. Picture people trading information with the same care they once reserved for valuable objects. News about conditions in other regions, techniques for improving food preservation, remedies for common ailments, strategies for keeping warm through winter. These forms of knowledge circulate through the community like a currency that enriches everyone who receives it. News about conditions in other regions, techniques for improving food preservation, remedies for common ailments, strategies for keeping warm through winter. These forms of knowledge circulate through the community like a currency that enriches everyone who receives it. The transportation and storage of goods present new challenges that require collective solutions. Picture communities organizing to create shared storage facilities, developing new methods for protecting resources from weather and pests, establishing systems for moving heavy or bulky items that no individual could manage alone. These cooperative efforts become models for the kind of large-scale organization that will be necessary for long-term survival and eventual prosperity. As the day's trading and work assignments are completed, as people settle into evening routines that have become remarkably different from the commercial relationships of the old world, picture the satisfaction that comes from participating in an economy based on mutual aid rather than individual accumulation. This isn't a return to some idealized past, but the creation of something new. A way of organizing human productivity that prioritizes everyone's survival and well-being over any individual's wealth or status. But even as communities learn to manage the practical challenges of work and exchange, even as they develop new forms of economic cooperation that sustain their physical lives, deeper questions arise about meaning, purpose, and the spiritual dimensions of existence in a world that has been fundamentally altered by loss and uncertainty. Economic survival may keep bodies alive, but what feeds the soul when everything familiar has been swept away? Picture yourself sitting by a flickering fire as evening settles over your transformed community, surrounded by people who have become your chosen family through shared hardship rather than blood relation. The daily work is done, the immediate needs for food and shelter have been addressed as well as possible, and now the mind turns to questions that commerce cannot answer, and practical skills cannot resolve. Imagine, if you will, the peculiar quiet that settles over communities where traditional forms of spiritual authority have been disrupted or destroyed. The great cathedrals, if they still stand, often echo with emptiness where congregations once gathered. Parish priests who survived the plague find themselves serving communities scattered and transformed beyond recognition. The religious festivals that once marked the rhythm of the year have been interrupted by the more pressing rhythms of survival. Yet in this apparent spiritual wilderness, something remarkable begins to emerge. Picture Sarah, our familiar guide, finding herself in conversations about meaning and purpose that she never would have imagined in her former life as a baker's daughter, concerned primarily with daily routines. The proximity of death, the collapse of old certainties, and the need to rebuild everything from basic principles have created space for questions and insights that more stable times might never have allowed. The traditional boundaries between different spiritual traditions begin to blur in ways that might have seemed scandalous in more settled times. Picture the wandering priest we met earlier leading prayers that incorporate elements from various Christian traditions, while the foreign merchant shares wisdom from his own spiritual background, and community members who might have once considered themselves simple, unlearned people offer insights gained from direct encounters with loss, survival, and the mysteries of existence. Consider how the immediate presence of death, not as a distant theological concept, but as a daily reality that has claimed friends, family, and neighbors, transforms spiritual understanding. Picture people who might once have attended church services out of habit or social obligation, now engaging with questions of mortality, meaning, and transcendence with the urgency of those who know from experience how fragile life can be. The development of new spiritual practices emerges organically from the community's shared experiences. Picture evening gatherings that begin as practical discussions about the next day's work, but gradually evolve into something resembling prayer or meditation. People sharing memories of those they've lost, not in formal funeral services, but in the ongoing conversation that helps a community process collective grief and find ways to honor the dead while caring for the living. Children, as they often do, become catalysts for spiritual innovation. Picture young ones asking questions that adults might be afraid to voice. Why did the plague happen? Where did grandmother go when she died? Why do we keep living when so many people we love are gone? These innocent inquiries force the community to articulate beliefs and hopes that might otherwise remain unexamined. The adults find themselves creating new forms of spiritual education that combine traditional religious teachings with the practical wisdom gained through surviving catastrophe. Picture Sarah teaching a child to bake bread while also talking about gratitude, about the mystery of how simple ingredients can become nourishment, about the importance of sharing what we have with those who have less. These aren't separate lessons about cooking and morality. They're integrated teachings about how to live with meaning in a difficult world. The role of nature in spiritual life becomes more prominent when human institutions have proven fragile. Picture community members finding comfort and insight in observing the cycles of seasons, the persistence of plants and animals, the reliability of sunrise and sunset even when human societies have been disrupted. The garden that provides food for physical survival also becomes a place of meditation on growth, death, renewal, and the mysterious processes that sustain life. Prayer, for those who practice it, takes on new forms shaped by immediate needs and circumstances. Picture not elaborate liturgies performed by trained clergy, but simple, heartfelt conversations with the divine that emerge from daily experience. Prayers for enough food to last another day, for the safety of community members who must travel to trade with other settlements, for wisdom in making decisions that affect everyone's survival, for comfort in the face of losses that seem too great to bear. The question of whether their suffering has meaning becomes a central spiritual challenge for the community. Picture people wrestling with the age-old question of why bad things happen to good people, but doing so not as an abstract theological exercise, but as an urgent practical matter. Some find meaning in the opportunity to discover their own strength and compassion. Others in the way that extreme circumstances have revealed the depth of human connections. Still others in the possibility that their survival might serve some larger purpose they don't yet understand. The development of new rituals helps the community mark important transitions and maintain connection to something larger than immediate survival. Picture Sarah working with others to create ceremonies for welcoming newcomers, for blessing the work that sustains the community, for marking the seasons and celebrating the small victories that keep hope alive. These rituals aren't elaborate or formal, but they serve the essential human need for meaning-making and shared recognition of life's significance. Individual spiritual practices adapt to new circumstances in creative ways. Picture people finding moments for personal reflection and prayer while engaged in necessary work, transforming routine tasks into opportunities for meditation. The repetitive motions of grinding grain, mending clothes, or tending fires become occasions for contemplation about life's deeper patterns and purposes. The presence of people from different spiritual backgrounds creates opportunities for learning and growth that might never have existed in more homogeneous communities. Picture Sarah discovering that the foreign merchant's practices of gratitude and mindfulness can enrich her own spiritual life, while he finds that Christian concepts of service and sacrifice speak to values he already held. These exchanges don't require anyone to abandon their fundamental beliefs, but they expand everyone's understanding of the many ways humans seek connection with the sacred. The question of how to maintain hope becomes both a practical and spiritual challenge. Picture community discussions about planning for the future, about whether it's wise to expect better times ahead or more prudent to focus on surviving the present moment. Some find hope in religious promises of eventual justice and reward. Others in the evidence of human resilience they witness daily. Still others in the possibility that their efforts to build a better community might benefit generations they'll never meet. The relationship between faith and doubt becomes more honest and complex when belief is tested by extreme circumstances. Picture people admitting fears and uncertainties they might never have voiced in more conventional religious settings, while also discovering forms of faith they never knew they possessed. The community becomes a place where doubt and belief can coexist, where questions are welcomed rather than discouraged, where spiritual growth is measured not by doctrinal correctness, but by compassion, courage, and commitment to the common good. As the evening fire burns lower and people prepare for sleep, picture the sense of peace that can emerge even in difficult circumstances when a community has found ways to address not just physical needs, but spiritual ones as well. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new questions about how to live with meaning in a transformed world. But tonight, surrounded by people who have become companions in the deepest journey of human existence, there is a kind of contentment that transcends circumstances. The spiritual life that emerges from this community isn't a return to some previous form of religious practice, but the birth of something new, a way of finding meaning that is grounded in lived experience, strengthened by diversity, and focused on the practical expression of love and compassion in daily life. But as the community grows in spiritual wisdom and emotional resilience, as people learn to find meaning and purpose even in the midst of ongoing uncertainty, new challenges emerge that will test everything they've learned about survival, cooperation, and the capacity to build something lasting from the ruins of what was lost. But here's something remarkable that's about to unfold before your eyes. As the seasons turn and your community stabilizes into something resembling permanent settlement, you begin to understand that survival isn't just about getting through each day, but about developing the skills and knowledge that will sustain life over the long term. Picture yourself no longer as someone simply reacting to immediate crises, but as a person actively building competence in the arts of living that will serve you and your neighbors for years to come. Imagine, if you will, standing in what has become your expanded garden as spring arrives for the second time since your community formed. The tentative plantings of that first desperate year have taught you lessons about soil, climate, and the delicate timing that determines whether seeds become sustenance or disappointment. Your hands, once soft from easier times, now bear the calluses that speak of real expertise in coaxing life from the earth. Picture Sarah, our faithful guide through this transformation, as she has evolved from a baker dependent on grain provided by others into someone who understands the entire cycle from seed to harvest to bread. She has learned to read the subtle signs that indicate when grain is ready for harvesting, how to thresh and winnow with tools crafted by community members, how to store grain in ways that protect it from moisture and pests through the long winter months. But consider how her learning extends beyond just the technical aspects of food production. Picture her developing an intuitive understanding of seasons, weather patterns, and the complex relationships between different crops that allow communities to maximize their harvests. She knows now that certain plants enrich the soil for other plants, That rotating crops prevents the depletion that comes from growing the same thing in the same place year after year. That diverse plantings provide protection against the crop failures that could devastate a community, dependent on single sources of nutrition. The concept of mastery takes on new meaning when it's directly connected to community survival. Picture the deep satisfaction Sarah feels as she teaches newcomers the skills she has developed, watching their initial fumbling efforts gradually develop into competence. There's something profound about knowledge that has immediate, visible benefits for people you care about. Her expertise isn't abstract or theoretical. It's the difference between her neighbors eating well or going hungry. Consider how seasonal rhythms begin to govern not just agricultural activities, but the entire flow of community life. Picture the way different times of year call for different kinds of expertise and cooperation. Spring brings the intensive work of planting, requiring everyone to coordinate their efforts to prepare soil, select seeds, and establish the gardens that will determine autumn's abundance. Summer demands constant attention to growing plants, careful management of water resources, and preparation for preservation and storage. The autumn harvest becomes a community celebration that would be unimaginable to people who simply buy their food from stores. Picture the profound satisfaction of gathering in crops that represent months of careful work, of seeing storage areas filled with the grain, vegetables, and preserved foods that will sustain everyone through winter's challenges. This isn't just practical accomplishment, it's a spiritual experience of participating in the ancient cycles that have sustained human life since the beginning of agriculture. But picture, too, how winter transforms from a season to be endured into a time for different kinds of productivity. The months when outdoor agricultural work is impossible become opportunities for crafting tools, repairing equipment, planning next year's improvements, and passing knowledge to younger community members. Sarah might spend winter evenings teaching children not just how to bake bread, but how to calculate ratios, how to adjust recipes based on available ingredients, how to troubleshoot the countless small problems that can turn potential success into disappointing failure. The development of specialized skills creates a web of interdependence that is both practical and deeply satisfying. Picture how Sarah's bread-making expertise connects to the miller who grinds grain, the farmer who grows wheat, the carpenter who builds and maintains ovens, the potter who creates the vessels needed for storage and preparation. Each person's mastery contributes to everyone's well-being, creating a sense of community accomplishment that transcends individual achievement. Consider how the definition of wealth has completely transformed for these survivors. Picture Sarah's pride not in accumulated possessions, but in the sophisticated understanding she has developed of her craft and its place in the community's survival. Her wealth consists of knowledge that can't be stolen, skills that improve with practice, and relationships with people who depend on her expertise and offer their own specialized knowledge in return. The process of skill development becomes a form of meditation and self-discovery. Picture Sarah discovering that the patience required for proper bread making has taught her patience in other areas of life, that the attention to detail necessary for successful baking has improved her ability to notice and respond to subtle changes in community dynamics, that the rhythm of daily bread preparation has become a source of stability and comfort in an otherwise uncertain world. But mastery in this context isn't just individual achievement, it's community capacity building. Picture Sarah working with others to establish backup systems that ensure essential knowledge isn't lost if something happens to any single person. She teaches multiple people the secrets of bread making, while also learning basics of other crafts from community members whose primary expertise lies in different areas. The integration of multiple skills becomes a survival strategy that would have been unnecessary in more specialized times. Picture Sarah as someone who has become competent not just in baking, but in basic carpentry, for maintaining her ovens and workspace, in plant identification, for finding wild ingredients and fuel, in basic medical care, for treating the minor burns and cuts that come with her work, and in teaching, for passing her knowledge to others. Consider how the community develops systems for recognizing and rewarding expertise that go beyond simple economic exchange. Picture celebrations that honor people who have achieved new levels of skill, formal and informal mentoring relationships that connect experienced craftspeople with eager learners, and storytelling traditions that preserve not just technical knowledge, but the wisdom that comes from years of practice and observation. The concept of innovation takes on new urgency when improvement can mean the difference between prosperity and hardship for everyone. Picture Sarah experimenting with new techniques, different ingredient combinations, and improved tools, but doing so carefully and systematically so that failures don't waste precious resources. Her innovations aren't just personal curiosity, they're community research and development aimed at making everyone's life better. The development of teaching skills becomes as important as the crafts being taught. Picture Sarah learning how to break complex processes down into manageable steps, how to identify the most common mistakes beginners make, how to create learning experiences that build confidence while developing competence. Her ability to transmit knowledge effectively multiplies her value to the community far beyond what her individual labor could accomplish. The psychological benefits of mastery become apparent in ways that might not have been visible in more prosperous times. Picture the confidence and sense of purpose that comes from knowing you possess skills that are genuinely needed, that your work makes a real difference in people's lives, that you are building something valuable, rather than just performing tasks to earn money for purchasing what others have made. Long-term planning becomes possible when communities develop reliable expertise in essential skills. Picture Sarah working with others to plan not just next year's bread production, but improvements to facilities, training programs for new bakers, and innovations that might increase efficiency or improve quality over several growing seasons. The community can make commitments and investments that extend beyond immediate survival, because they have confidence in their collective capabilities. Picture Sarah's pride in achieving new levels of skill with bread making, knowing that her personal growth directly translates into better nutrition, greater food security, and increased resilience for everyone she cares about. Her individual mastery and community service aren't separate goals. They're the same aspiration expressed through skilled, caring work. As evening falls, and Sarah reflects on another day of productive work that has added to the community's store of food, knowledge, and capability, picture the profound contentment that comes from living a life where personal development and social contribution are perfectly aligned. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to refine skills, teach others, and continue building the foundation of competence that will sustain the community through whatever challenges lie ahead. This is mastery not as individual achievement isolated from its context, but as the deepest form of service to the people and place that have become home. And it points towards something even larger, the possibility that these hard-won skills and insights might contribute to a broader renaissance of human capability and wisdom that extends far beyond any single community. But as your community develops its practical mastery and achieves a kind of functional stability, as people grow skilled in the arts of survival and cooperation, a deeper transformation begins to emerge. Picture yourself not just as someone who has learned to survive in a changed world, but as a participant in something larger, the gradual recovery and renewal of human civilization itself, built now on foundations more solid and sustainable than those that came before. Imagine, if you will, the profound satisfaction of planting seeds in soil enriched by years of careful tending. Each green shoot a promise that the future will be more abundant than the past. Imagine, if you will, standing on a hill overlooking the valley where your community has taken root, watching smoke rise from dozens of chimneys, seeing well-tended fields stretching toward the horizon, observing the paths worn by regular travel between your settlement and others that have similarly emerged from the chaos of the plague years. What you see isn't just recovery. It's the birth of new forms of human organization based on lessons learned through survival and hardship. Picture Sarah, now recognized not just as a skilled baker but as one of the community elders whose wisdom helps guide important decisions, as she participates in conversations with visitors from other settlements. These aren't chance encounters with desperate refugees, but deliberate exchanges between communities that have achieved enough stability to think beyond immediate survival. They're sharing knowledge, trading specialized goods, and beginning to weave the networks that will eventually connect scattered settlements into larger patterns of cooperation and prosperity. Consider how the values developed during the hardest times have become the foundation for this emerging new world. The emphasis on fairness, the habits of sharing resources according to need rather than accumulating wealth, the deep respect for practical knowledge and community contribution. These aren't just survival strategies that will be abandoned when abundance returns. They've become cultural principles that shape how these new societies organize themselves and treat their members. The stories that communities tell about their origins during the plague years serve a function similar to the founding myths of ancient civilizations. Picture Sarah sharing with children and newcomers the tales of those first desperate seasons, when survival depended on unprecedented cooperation, when traditional social barriers dissolved in the face of shared necessity, when people discovered reserves of courage and compassion they never knew they possessed. These stories aren't just entertainment. They're the cultural DNA that will influence how future generations understand their obligations to each other. Picture the gradual development of new institutions that reflect the lessons learned during the Reconstruction years. The councils that make community decisions operate by consensus rather than inherited authority. The systems for managing shared resources prioritize sustainability and fairness over maximum extraction. The educational approaches that pass knowledge to children emphasize both practical skills and the values of mutual support that enabled survival when everything seemed lost. But consider, too, how the memory of loss and vulnerability creates a different relationship to abundance when prosperity begins to return. Picture Sarah's community as their harvests improve and their food security increases, not rushing to accumulate individual wealth, but continuing to maintain the community stores that ensured everyone's survival during harder times. The fear of scarcity never completely disappears, but it manifests as prudent preparation and community resilience rather than individual hoarding. The networks forming between recovered communities create new opportunities for specialization and trade, but based on principles learned during the years when trust was a matter of survival. Picture exchanges between settlements that prioritize fairness and long-term relationship building over short-term profit maximization. Communities that have learned to depend on each other for survival understand that exploitation of trading partners is ultimately self-destructive. The approach to technology and innovation reflects the values of societies built by people who understand the connection between human welfare and practical capability. Picture developments in agriculture, crafts, and community organization that emphasize sustainability, accessibility, and community benefit, rather than just efficiency or individual advantage. What emerges next will show you exactly why these communities became the foundation for humanity's greatest renaissance. The innovations that emerge aren't just clever solutions to technical problems. They're expressions of social values about how humans should live together. Children growing up in these recovered communities develop different assumptions about normal social relations than those who experience the old world's hierarchies and inequalities. Picture young people who take for granted that everyone in a community deserves food, shelter, and meaningful work, who assume that decisions affecting everyone should involve everyone, who see cooperation and mutual aid not as exceptional generosity, but as obvious common sense. The spiritual dimensions of this recovery process create new forms of meaning and celebration that honor both loss and renewal. Picture festivals that commemorate not just traditional religious holidays, but the community's own history of survival and rebuilding. Rituals that honor those who died in the plague years while celebrating the life and growth that their sacrifice made possible. Spiritual practices that emphasize gratitude for community, for the Earth's productivity, for the human capacities that enabled survival against overwhelming odds. The integration of different cultural traditions, which began as practical necessity when displaced people needed to cooperate for survival, evolves into rich new forms of art, music, and celebration. Picture Sarah's community hosting visitors with festivals that blend traditions from the various backgrounds of community members, creating new forms of cultural expression that wouldn't have been possible in more homogeneous times. The development of knowledge preservation and transmission systems reflects the hard-learned lesson that essential wisdom must not be lost to future catastrophes. Picture libraries and schools that emphasize not just abstract learning, but the practical skills and community values that enabled survival and recovery. Educational approaches that ensure every community member has both specialized expertise and basic competence in the full range of skills necessary for community resilience. The relationship to the natural environment reflects the intimate connection between human welfare and ecological health that became obvious when communities had to depend entirely on local resources. Picture land management practices that prioritize long-term productivity over short-term extraction, agricultural methods that improve rather than deplete soil, and settlement patterns that work with rather than against natural systems. As trade networks expand and prosperity increases, the temptation to abandon the lessons of the hard years creates ongoing challenges and opportunities for moral growth. Picture Sarah and other community leaders having discussions about how to maintain their values as their circumstances improve, how to welcome newcomers without losing the social cohesion that enabled their success, how to engage with communities that might not share their commitment to equality and cooperation. The recovery process reveals the extent to which the plague years, for all their tragedy, created opportunities for human development that might not have emerged under more comfortable circumstances. Picture people who discovered leadership abilities they never knew they possessed, who developed skills they never would have learned in more specialized times, who formed relationships across social boundaries that previous eras would never have permitted. The emerging new world isn't a return to what existed before the plague, but something unprecedented. Human societies built consciously on principles of cooperation, sustainability, and shared welfare, founded by people who understand from direct experience both the fragility of civilization and the remarkable human capacity for resilience and mutual care. As Sarah looks out over her thriving community on a peaceful evening, Surrounded by people who have become family through shared struggle and accomplishment, she understands that they are living in the answer to countless prayers whispered by those who suffered through humanity's darkest hours. Picture, if you will, that moment of profound recognition. The warm glow of candlelight reflecting in her eyes as she realizes that from the ashes of the old world, they have not just survived, they have created something better than what was lost. And perhaps that realization points toward the final and most profound lesson of this long journey. That even the darkest chapters in human history can become the foundation for renaissance, renewal, and the creation of more just and sustainable ways of living together on this earth we all share. Picture yourself awakening slowly from the deepest, most restorative sleep you've experienced in months. The light filtering through your window isn't the harsh glare of fluorescent bulbs or the cold glow of electronic screens, but gentle sunlight that has traveled 93 million miles to warm your face with the same energy that sustained life through every era of human history, including that darkest winter of 1351 we've just experienced together. Feel the weight of your blankets, soft and warm, woven by machines that would have seemed like pure magic to medieval eyes. Picture Sarah, our brave baker, struggling through those winter nights with rough wool scratching her skin, stones cold beneath her straw mattress, fire that needed constant tending to keep deadly cold at bay. Now sense the miracle of thermostat-controlled warmth that surrounds you. Protection from winter's icy grip that requires no more effort than the gentle adjustment of a dial. Run your hands across the smooth cotton of your sheets, fabric so fine that medieval nobility might have traded fortunes for its softness. Picture the coarse linen and scratchy wool that passed for luxury in that distant world, while you rest wrapped in comfort that surpasses anything kings and queens of old could have imagined. The thread count of your pillowcase represents a level of craftsmanship that would have taken medieval artisans months to achieve. Yet it's so common in your world that you likely never give it a moment's thought. Listen to the silence around you. Not the ominous quiet of abandoned villages and empty fields, but the peaceful hush of safety and abundance. No church bells tolling endlessly for the dead. No distant cries of grief from neighbors who have lost everything. No scratch of desperate fingers against doors seeking help that cannot be given. Instead, perhaps the gentle hum of your refrigerator, that miraculous box that preserves food with reliability that would have saved millions of lives in 1351. Imagine reaching for the simple glass of water on your nightstand, clean and pure, available instantly without thought or effort. Picture the hours Sarah spent carefully rationing precious drops, the elaborate preparations required to ensure water was safe to drink, the constant worry about sources becoming contaminated or simply running dry. Your casual sip represents a miracle of engineering, infrastructure, and community cooperation that brings safe drinking water from distant sources directly to your bedside. The winter that threatened to claim entire communities now merely requires us to adjust a thermostat. The infections that once meant certain death are conquered by medicines we keep casually in bathroom cabinets. The isolation that drove people to madness in those dark months is broken by devices that connect us instantly to loved ones across the globe. Picture John, the blacksmith whose calloused hands ached through every frozen night. He would have stared in wonder at the simple abundance of your kitchen, where tools sharper than his finest blade are tucked away in drawers, where heat appears instantly at the touch of a button, where light banishes darkness without a moment's thought or preparation. Even in our challenging moments today, we are surrounded by comforts that would have seemed like magic to those who came before us. The book beside your bed contains more stories than a medieval village might hear in a lifetime. The device in your pocket holds more knowledge than the greatest libraries of the ancient world. The very fact that you can listen to these words, spoken to you across time and space, represents a kind of communication that would have been considered supernatural just generations ago. As you breathe deeply now, feeling your body relax into this moment of profound comfort, remember how the human spirit that sustained our ancestors through their darkest trials lives on in us. But now, instead of merely surviving, we have the extraordinary privilege of thriving. The same resilience that helped people endure through bitter cold and meager harvests now empowers us to build, to create, to dream on scales unimaginable to previous generations. The community spirit that once gathered around shared hearths to weather the harshest seasons has evolved into a global network of connection and support. The hope that sustained people through months of darkness is now illuminated by the literal lights that surround us, by the knowledge that dawn comes not just with the sun, but with every choice we make to appreciate the abundance in our lives. Take a moment to truly feel this gratitude settling over you like the warmest blanket. The stories we've shared tonight aren't just tales of the past. They're reminders of how far we've traveled, how much we've gained, how rich our lives have become, Every convenience, every comfort, every moment of ease represents generations of human ingenuity, perseverance, and hope. The courage that drove our ancestors to face another day, despite overwhelming hardship, is the same courage that allows us to face our own challenges with perspective and grace. The love that bound families together in times of scarcity is the same love that surrounds us now, amplified by the ability to express it freely, to share it widely, to nurture it without the constant fear of survival. As you prepare to drift into peaceful sleep, surrounded by comfort our ancestors could never have imagined, carry with you this deep appreciation for the extraordinary ordinary of your life. The safety that wraps around you, the abundance that sustains you, the connections that enrich you. These aren't accidents. They're the accumulated gifts of countless generations who persevered through darkness so that you might rest in light. And perhaps, dear listener, as you've journeyed with me through humanity's darkest winter, you've discovered something profound about your own capacity for resilience. The same unbreakable spirit that sustained Sarah, Thomas, and countless others through 1351 flows through your veins as well. When you face your own challenges, whether they feel as overwhelming as a medieval plague or as simple as a difficult day, remember the courage you've witnessed tonight. Let this gratitude be your final thought as you close your eyes tonight. You are the answer to countless prayers whispered by those who came before. You are living in the someday that sustained them through their hardest hours. Your comfortable rest is the dream that helped them endure their sleepless nights. As you settle into your cozy corner of the present, consider how this journey through 1351 might illuminate your own path forward. Perhaps tomorrow, when small inconveniences arise, you'll remember Sarah's quiet dignity in rationing precious grain. When relationships feel strained, you might recall how strangers became family through shared hardship. When the future seems uncertain, you could draw strength from communities that rebuilt not just their lives, but entire civilizations from ashes. And in this profound appreciation, in this recognition of how blessed we truly are, may you find the deepest peace. For you are not just surviving the winter of life, you are flourishing in an eternal spring of possibility, comfort, and hope. Rest well, dear listener. Tomorrow brings another day of extraordinary, ordinary miracles. Another chance to appreciate the remarkable gift of this modern life we so often take for granted. But tonight, simply rest in gratitude, knowing that you are living better than kings and queens of old ever dreamed possible.